In the early 1800s, winter in the Rocky Mountains was not something you endured. It was something that actively tried to kill you. Cold was only part of the problem. The real danger was what cold did to everything else. Wet snow soaked into logs. Wind pulled heat out of cabins faster than a fire could replace it. Smoke filled rooms because damp wood would not burn clean. Men woke up stiff, exhausted, already losing ground before the day began. Most cabins looked solid from the outside. Thick logs, heavy roofs, small windows. But inside they bled heat. Walls stayed cold to the touch. Frost formed along seams. You could feel warmth leave the room the moment the fire died down. Frontiersmen understood one thing clearly: if your cabin failed in winter, nothing else mattered. Not hunting skill, not strength, not experience. A cold cabin turned every task into a risk. Cutting wood became dangerous. Repairing tools became painful. Sleeping became shallow and broken. Families measured winter in losses. How many tools rusted beyond repair? How much extra firewood was burned just to stay barely warm? How many days productivity dropped to nothing because everything was wet and cold? Most settlers responded the same way. They added more chinking, more mud, more moss. They sealed cracks tighter every year. The idea was simple: stop air movement, trap heat. But many noticed something unsettling. The tighter the cabin became, the damper it felt. Walls stayed wet longer, logs darkened, fires smoked more. Heat didn't last. Nobody had language for it yet, but they were fighting the wrong enemy. Cold was visible, moisture was not. In that environment, a cabin that stayed even a little warmer was not a luxury. It was a survival advantage. A difference of 10 degrees could mean sleeping through the night instead of waking to feed the fire. 20 degrees meant fewer illnesses, fewer mistakes, more strength left for tomorrow. And in one remote settlement during a winter like all the others, one mountain man decided that the way everyone built cabins was fundamentally wrong. That decision would change how warm his cabin stayed while everyone else kept freezing. Most frontiersmen believed cold was the enemy. They talked about it constantly: how deep the snow fell, how hard the wind blew, how long the nights lasted. Every winter story centered on temperature. So they built to fight cold directly. Cabins were sealed tighter each year. Cracks were packed with mud, clay, moss, or animal hair. Extra layers were added wherever a draft could be felt. Windows were made smaller, doors heavier. The goal was simple: keep the warm air inside and keep the cold air out. On paper, it made sense. But in practice, something else happened. The tighter a cabin became, the more it trapped moisture. Snow melted against the walls and soaked into the logs. Breath-cooking steam and damp clothing released moisture inside, and with nowhere to escape, that moisture stayed. Walls never fully dried. Floors felt cold even near the fire. Smoke lingered because damp wood burned poorly. People noticed the symptoms, but not the cause. Logs darkened over time. Mold crept into corners. Metal tools rusted faster indoors than out. Firewood stacked near the house absorbed moisture from the air itself. A fire burned hard at first, then faded quickly, forcing constant tending. Men assumed this was unavoidable. The mountains were wet. Winter was wet. That was simply life. They responded by sealing more, burning more, and working harder just to stay even. Some burned twice as much wood as they had a decade earlier for the same amount of heat. Others blamed poor timber or bad luck. Very few questioned the basic assumption. Cold was obvious, moisture was silent. Wet wood does not burn efficiently. Wet walls pull heat away faster than dry ones. Damp air makes cold feel deeper and heavier. These facts were not written down anywhere, but they were felt every winter in sore joints, smoky cabins, and endless woodpiles. Most cabins were not failing because they were too open. They were failing because they were too wet, until someone stopped trying to seal the cabin tighter and instead asked a different question. What if the problem wasn't air moving, but water reaching the walls in the first place? The man who questioned it was not known as an inventor. He wasn't educated in engineering. He didn't talk in theories. He was known as practical, quiet, observant. He had lived through enough winters to know when effort was being wasted. He had sealed cabins like everyone else. He had burned extra wood. He had woken up to damp walls and cold floors despite doing everything right. And one winter he reached a conclusion that felt uncomfortable. The problem wasn't that the cabin leaked air. The problem was that the cabin never stayed dry. Instead of asking how to keep cold out, he asked something simpler. Why does the cabin keep getting wet in the first place? Snow piled against the walls and slowly melted. Rain soaked logs during shoulder seasons. Wind-driven moisture worked its way into every surface. Even when the fire burned all day, the walls never truly dried. So he made a decision that immediately looked wrong to everyone else. He didn't reinforce the cabin walls. He built another structure around them, not attached, not touching, set several feet away. From the outside, it looked like he had lost his mind. A house inside another house, a wide, rough outer wall standing around the cabin like a fence that forgot its purpose. Neighbors stopped to stare. Some laughed, some shook their heads. A few told him directly he was wasting timber that could have gone toward another shed, another barn, or more firewood. "You're building backward," one man said. "Wind will tear through that," said another. "You'll trap damp air and rot the whole thing." The criticism was constant and confident, but he kept building. The outer wall wasn't tight. It wasn't sealed. There were gaps between boards. It wasn't meant to stop air. It was meant to stop rain and snow from ever touching the cabin itself. Between the outer wall and the cabin, he left open space, enough room to walk, enough room for air to move. Most people saw wasted effort. He saw separation. And separation, he believed, was the key to staying dry. That winter, while others focused on their stoves, he focused on his walls. And once the snow began to fall, the difference started to become impossible to ignore. By the time the outer wall was finished, the jokes had settled into routine. Men passing by called it a barn built in the wrong place. Others said it looked like a mistake that would need fixing by spring. A few predicted it wouldn't survive the first serious storm. The structure itself was plain. No decoration, no clever joinery, just upright posts set in the ground, horizontal beams and rough boards nailed vertically. The boards were close but not tight. You could see daylight between them. That alone bothered people. Every rule of cabin building said gaps were bad. Gaps meant drafts. Drafts meant cold. Everyone knew that. The wall stood several feet away from the cabin on all sides, forming a wide, covered space between the two. The roof extended past the outer wall, throwing water even farther away. Snow piled against the outside of the structure, not the cabin itself. To most eyes, it looked unfinished. "You're letting air in on purpose," one neighbor said. "That defeats the whole point." But the man didn't argue. He just kept working. He stacked firewood in the space between the wall and the cabin, lifting it off the ground. He stored tools there too, out of direct rain, but still exposed to moving air. He left the ground bare, not sealed, not packed tight. Nothing about it felt airtight, and that made people uneasy. Frontiersmen trusted things they could block, seal, and force into submission. This wall didn't do that. It redirected instead of resisting. When the first heavy snowfall came, the cabin walls stayed dry. Snow that would normally press directly against logs now sat several feet away. Meltwater never touched the cabin. Wind still moved through the gap, but slower, calmer. Inside the fire burned the same as before. No new stove, no extra fuel. But the walls didn't feel as cold. At first, no one wanted to admit it. They blamed mild weather, temporary luck, anything but the wall. But as the weeks passed and storms piled up, the laughter stopped. Because the stupid wall wasn't failing. It was quietly doing exactly what it was built to do. Most people blamed the wind. You could hear it. You could feel it push through cracks. It made sense to think wind was stealing the heat. But the man with the outer wall watched something else. He watched how water behaved. Snow melted slowly against exposed logs and soaked in. Rain didn't need gaps to cause damage. It spread across surfaces, seeped into wood, and stayed there. Once logs were wet, they became cold sponges. Heat from the fire didn't warm the room, it dried the walls first. And that took energy. Wet wood always feels colder than dry wood. Not because it is colder, but because it pulls heat away faster. That was happening every hour of every winter. The outer wall changed that. Rain no longer touched the cabin. Snow no longer pressed against it. The logs stayed dry even during long storms. And dry logs behaved differently. Inside the cabin, the fire began to feel stronger without burning any hotter. Heat stayed in the room longer after the fire settled down. Floors warmed sooner. Walls didn't sweat. Wind still existed. Air still moved. But without water feeding into the system, the wind stopped being the problem everyone thought it was. This was the part most frontiersmen missed. Moving air does not cause cold by itself. Wet surfaces do. A dry wall can handle airflow. A wet wall cannot. The space between the outer wall and the cabin created a buffer. Wind slowed. Moisture dropped out. Air moved, but gently. The cabin lived in calmer conditions without being sealed shut. It wasn't about blocking nature. It was about keeping water from reaching the structure in the first place. Most cabins failed because they tried to fight everything at once, wind, cold, snow, by sealing tighter and tighter. That trapped moisture and made the problem worse. This design did the opposite. It accepted airflow and rejected water. And once that balance was set, everything else followed. Firewood dried faster. Walls stayed warm. Heat stayed where it belonged. The enemy had never been the wind. It was moisture reaching places it shouldn't. And for the first time, someone had found a way to stop it without suffocating the cabin itself. The most important part of the structure wasn't the wall itself. It was the space between the walls. That gap looked like wasted room to everyone else. Just empty air. Space you couldn't live in. Space you couldn't heat directly. But that air did something no solid wall could. It separated the cabin from the weather. Wind that hit the outer wall lost strength before it reached the cabin. Rain driven sideways by storms hit the first barrier and fell harmlessly to the ground. Snow piled up outside, never touching the logs that actually mattered. Inside, that gap air kept moving, slowly, constantly, enough to carry moisture away, but not enough to strip heat. This was the balance no one else achieved. Most cabins had only two states, either open and drafty or sealed and damp. There was no middle ground. The air gap created one. Moisture that entered the space didn't stay long. It moved out through the gaps in the outer wall. Nothing sat long enough to soak in. Nothing stayed wet. The cabin walls stayed dry through storms that soaked everything else nearby. And dry walls behave differently. They warm faster. They hold heat longer, they stop pulling energy from the fire. Inside, the man noticed the change first at night. After the fire burned down, the cabin stayed warm longer. He didn't need to wake up as often to feed the stove. The cold didn't rush in the moment flames dropped. That was new. He noticed it in the morning, too. The floor wasn't as stiff with cold. The air felt lighter, less heavy, less damp. The gap did something else no one expected. It reduced temperature swings. During the day, sunlight warmed the outer structure slightly. That heat didn't escape immediately. At night, the gap slowed heat loss. The cabin lived in a more stable environment, even though no extra heat was added. It wasn't insulation in the usual sense. It was control. The air gap didn't stop air. It managed it. It didn't trap heat. It protected it. And once that space existed, the cabin stopped fighting the mountains directly. It finally had breathing room. That breathing room made all the difference. The change showed up most clearly in the firewood. Before the outer wall, his wood behaved like everyone else's. It looked fine when stacked, but it stayed heavy. When burned, it hissed. Steam escaped before flame. Smoke filled the room before heat did. Wet wood wastes energy. The fire spends its strength boiling off water before it can warm the cabin. Once the wall was up, that changed. He stacked his firewood in the space between the cabin and the outer wall. It never touched the ground. Rain never hit it. Snow never melted into it. Air moved around every piece. Within weeks, the difference was obvious. The wood felt lighter in the hand. Split faces changed color. Bark loosened and fell away. When two pieces were knocked together, they rang instead of thudding. When burned, the change was immediate. The fire caught faster. Flames burned cleaner. Smoke dropped. Heat came early and stayed longer. The stove didn't need constant feeding. Neighbors noticed it too. They burned twice the wood to get half the heat. Their fires smoked. Chimneys clogged faster. They blamed bad timber or poor cutting. But the trees were the same. The only difference was storage. Dry wood is not a small advantage in winter. It defines how much heat you get from every swing of the axe. With better firewood, the cabin changed again. Rooms warmed faster. Nights were easier. Mornings started earlier because the fire responded instead of fighting back. The wall didn't create heat. It made every piece of fuel work harder. That mattered more than any new stove ever could. And for the first time, people began to understand that the wall wasn't just protecting the cabin. It was protecting the energy that kept the man alive. Once that became clear, the laughter didn't come back. Because no one who had fought wet firewood through a hard winter could ignore what dry wood meant. It wasn't comfort, it was survival. The difference didn't announce itself all at once. No one stepped inside with a thermometer and declared a number. That came later. At first, people noticed smaller things. They noticed that his chimney smoked less. They noticed snow melted differently around his cabin. They noticed he wasn't cutting wood as often as everyone else. Then they noticed how it felt to step inside. You came in from the cold, expecting the usual shock. That moment when your hands ache and your breath fogs the room. But it didn't happen the same way. The air felt warmer immediately, not hot, just steady. You could stand still without shivering. Over time, the difference became impossible to dismiss. Men who visited late at night noticed the cabin stayed warm even when the fire was low. In other cabins, the cold crept back the moment the flames died down. Here, it didn't. Eventually, someone measured it. On a night when nearby cabins struggled to stay above freezing indoors, his cabin sat nearly 29 degrees warmer. Same weather, same elevation, same type of wood, same stove design. The only difference was the wall. That number spread fast. 29 degrees wasn't comfort. It was a margin of safety. It meant sleeping through the night. It meant fewer illnesses. It meant tools that worked in the morning instead of being too cold to handle. It also meant less fear. Frontier winters wore people down mentally. You planned your day around cold. You rushed tasks. You made mistakes. You stayed inside when work needed doing. A warmer cabin changed that rhythm. He didn't burn more wood. He didn't stay up all night feeding the fire. He didn't change his routine. He just stopped losing heat. Once people understood that arguments about appearance stopped. Nobody cared how the structure looked anymore. They cared about results, and the result was simple and undeniable. One man stayed warmer than everyone else without working harder. That's when the questions started to change. Not why would you build that, but how soon can I build one too? The warmth was what people talked about first. That was easy to notice. But the real value showed up in quieter ways. Tools stopped rusting. Axes left hanging overnight were ready to use in the morning. Saws didn't seize. Metal stayed clean longer because moisture no longer settled everywhere. That saved time and effort every single day. Clothing dried faster, too. Wet coats and gloves could be hung in the covered space instead of near the fire. They dried without filling the cabin with steam. The air inside stayed clearer. Breathing felt easier. Work changed. Instead of waiting for rare, calm days, he could split wood repair gear and sort supplies under cover. Snow and rain no longer dictated when work happened. That alone made winter feel shorter. There was also a mental shift. Most settlers lived under constant winter pressure. Everything felt delayed. Simple tasks turned into ordeals. That wears on people. Tempers shortened, energy dropped. His days felt different. He moved between tasks without rushing. He worked longer without exhaustion. He slept better because the cabin stayed warm through the night. Children noticed it too. They spent more time moving instead of sitting still near the fire. They got sick less often. Coughs faded quicker. None of this showed up in numbers at first. There was no ledger for it. But people saw the difference in how he lived through winter instead of merely surviving it. Neighbors began stopping by for reasons that had nothing to do with curiosity. They came to dry boots, to warm up properly, to work beside him when weather shut everything else down. That's when the idea shifted in people's minds. This wasn't just about heat. It was about control. The wall didn't fight winter. It removed winter's constant pressure from daily life. That changed how much work could be done, how long energy lasted, and how people felt by spring. By the time the snow finally melted, it was clear the wall had given more than warmth. It had given back time, effort, and peace of mind. And once people experienced that, they stopped asking whether it was worth the wood. They started asking what it would cost not to build one. Frontier communities changed their minds quietly. There was no public apology. No one admitted they had been wrong. That wasn't how things worked. Instead, people watched. They waited. Then they acted. The first man to copy the design didn't say much. He just started setting posts a few feet away from his cabin walls the following spring. Others noticed and pretended not to. By the next winter, there were 2, then 4. Each man adjusted the idea slightly. Some built the outer wall higher. Others left wider gaps between boards. A few extended the roof farther out to keep snow from piling close to the structure. But the principle stayed the same. Separate the weather from the cabin. Let air move. Keep water out. Results spread faster than explanations ever could. The men who copied the design burned less wood. Their cabins stayed warmer longer. Firewood dried better. Tools lasted longer. Work continued when it normally stopped. That was enough. No one needed diagrams or arguments. Winter did the testing. Cabins either worked or they didn't. By the third year, the design stopped being unusual. It became something you expected to see. New settlers arriving in the area noticed it immediately and asked why houses were built inside other structures. The answer was always practical. Because it stays dry. Because it stays warm. Because winter is easier. No one talked about theory. They talked about outcomes. Frontier people respected one thing above all else: solutions that worked under pressure. This one did. What started as a joke turned into a pattern. What looked wasteful became efficient. What seemed backward became the smart way to build. Innovation didn't spread because someone said it was better. It spread because people lived through winter and came out stronger on the other side. By the time spring returned, the question was no longer whether the wall made sense. The question was why anyone had built cabins without one in the first place. What those frontiersmen built had no name at the time. They didn't call it a system. They didn't describe it as a method. They just knew it worked. Decades later, builders and engineers would give it proper language. They would talk about double walls, ventilated cavities, rain screens, thermal buffers, moisture control. But the idea was already there. Modern builders eventually reached the same conclusion through testing and failure. Water is the real enemy of buildings, not cold by itself, not wind by itself. Moisture is what destroys heat performance, rots materials, and shortens the life of a structure. Stop water first and everything else becomes easier. That outer wall did exactly what modern rain screen systems do today. It took the weather hit so the real structure didn't have to. It allowed air to move so moisture never got trapped. It created a controlled environment instead of an exposed one. What's important is that this wasn't accidental. The man didn't get lucky. He observed cause and effect. He noticed that dry things stayed warm and wet things stayed cold. He noticed that airflow helped drying, but rain ruined everything. So he separated the two forces. That logic still applies. You see it in modern, cold climate homes with ventilated siding, in barns built with wide overhangs, in sheds raised off the ground, in any structure meant to last in wet or cold environments. The materials have changed. The thinking has not. Modern science didn't invent this idea. It explained it. And that matters. It reminds us that frontier builders weren't ignorant or primitive. They were experimental. They tested ideas with real consequences. Failure meant loss. Success meant survival. This design survived because it solved a real problem using basic principles anyone could understand. No rare materials, no complex construction, just wood, air, and space used correctly. That's why the idea didn't disappear. It quietly became standard practice wherever winter and moisture demanded respect. Long after the original cabin disappeared, the logic behind that stupid wall stayed alive. Because buildings like people last longer when they stay dry. The wall was never about being clever. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about innovation for its own sake. It was about paying attention. Most people fought winter the same way year after year. They added effort, more wood, more ceiling, more exhaustion. When it didn't work, they assumed that was just the price of living there. One man stopped and asked why the struggle never ended. He didn't try to overpower the environment. He changed how he interacted with it. Instead of sealing tighter, he stepped back. He created distance. He let air do what air does best and stopped water from reaching what mattered. That's the lesson frontier life taught again and again. Survival rarely comes from force. It comes from understanding. The mountains didn't become gentler. The winters didn't shorten. The storms didn't weaken, but his life inside them became easier because he stopped wasting energy fighting the wrong problem. That approach is easy to forget today. Modern systems promise comfort through complexity. More layers, more machines, more controls. But the basic rules haven't changed. Dry structures perform better. Dry fuel burns hotter. Dry environments reduce stress. The frontier builders learned that the hard way. Their solutions weren't pretty. They weren't fashionable. They worked. And when something works under pressure, it spreads. The outer wall that once drew laughter became normal. The idea that looked backward became common sense. What mattered was not how it looked, but how it performed when winter arrived. That's why this story still matters. It isn't about a wall. It's about thinking clearly when conditions are harsh. About questioning assumptions everyone else accepts. About choosing effectiveness over tradition. In the end, the man didn't beat winter. He understood it. And that understanding kept his cabin warmer, his work steadier, and his life intact while others kept struggling. On the frontier, that was the only victory that counted.